Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support in our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, and the NBA Finals are here. We are done with Game 1. We are recording this the day after, and what a Game 1 it was with the Indiana Pacers making a fourth quarter comeback again. Another fourth quarter comeback for the ages to take the series 1-0, winning 111-110. Tyrese Haliburton hitting the game winner. And this is funny because you look at the Pacers from their perspective, right? It was a pretty balanced offensive attack, right? Because even though Haliburton hit the game winner, right, finished with 14 points, 10 rebounds, 6 assists. And then you look around, Siakam with 19 and 10, Nesmith with 10, Nembhard with 14, Obi Toppin with 17, McConnell with 9. It was a very balanced attack where in the first half, the Pacers were awful. They had 19 turnovers in the first half and just could not get a lot going on the offensive end for most of that game. But the funny thing was, and this was one of the strangest games to watch, despite the fact that they turned the ball over so many times, they were only down 12 points. It was 57-45 at halftime, right? So part of that was, honestly, for the Pacers, they actually defensively, even when they were turning the ball over, doing a pretty decent job, right? They prevented Oklahoma City from getting a lot of transition buckets off those turnovers, right? I think some of those turnovers were also not live ball turnovers. They were like offensive fouls, out of bounds, but still 19 turnovers is 19 turnovers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you look at that from that perspective. Then you also look at the rebounding. They out-rebounded Oklahoma City 56-39, right? And this was key because Oklahoma City decided in going into the game to start with a smaller lineup. Hartenstein did not start. They did not start with the double bigs, and instead they replaced him with Case and Wallace, right? So I guess that was kind of to make them a more fast, more handsy defensive lineup, right, where they could probably do a better job of switching, maybe do a little bit better at the point of attack, right? Siakam might be a tough guard because if you have the double bigs, right, which big can really stay in front of him, right? Because, you know, Hartenstein may be a little slower, right? And Holmgren may be a little bit less physical. But it was kind of a bizarre decision because you feel like usually that's the type of decision you might make later in the series. Of course, some of that's hindsight because they were up for literally the entire game except for the last second of the game where the Pacers hit the game winner. And it's funny because we've seen the Pacers do this all postseason where even when they're down, they're not completely out. And it was funny because you're watching OKC and they're playing crazy defense, right? SGA's scoring mostly at will for most of the game, right? But again, they're never up 20 plus points because you would think if you turn the ball over 20 times in a half, you're down 20 plus. And they weren't. They were only down 12. So you're like, do the Pacers have a chance? Maybe. But even then, in the fourth quarter, right? OKC eventually pushes the lead up, right? They start, the quarters, use the second and fourths with SGA on the bench, right? So they were able to actually build the lead up a little bit more, right? With a couple of Caruso buckets and a couple of Jalen Williams buckets right off of, fast breaks and turnovers, right? So with 9 minutes and 40 seconds to go, right? Jalen Williams gets the steal. It's the inbounds turnover, right, where McConnell's inbounding the ball, and that's a live ball turnover, and he gets out, and he gets a fast break dunk. So they're up 15 with 9.5 minutes to go, basically, right? And then Nembhard gets an and one, right? You got a couple of Toppin threes in there, 3 threes, actually, because he had a stretch in the first half when he first came in where he was awful. It was a lot of turnovers. I mean, actually, if you look at the turnovers themselves, they had 24 turnovers. Half those turnovers came from Nesmith and Obi Toppin, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or no, half of them came from Nesmith and Turner because Turner was bad in the first half because he wasn't able to take advantage of some of the possessions where he's got a smaller guy on him. He looked a little slow. He looked a little uncomfortable trying to go up. Just didn't really look good. Even on defense, didn't really do a whole lot. You had a lot, like I said, you had a lot of bad performances by the Pacers in the first half. But then the Pacers cut it down, get a few more buckets, then all of a sudden, boom, Miles Turner banks in the 3, off the pump fake, sidestep, and it's a 4-point game with 6 minutes to go. And you're like, is Indiana actually going to come back and win this? Because most of the time I assumed OKC was going to win it, right? Then you got a couple trips to the line, right? And then Haliburton gets that finger roll with about a little under 5 minutes. So this is crunch time. It's a 4-point game. Then SGA gets a layup, couple of free throws. Siakam misses a pair of free throws, but then there's a lane violation, so he gets a third attempt. And then it's a 7-point game. Then OKC, you get a couple SGA buckets, a Lou Dort block on Nesmith in transition. And it's what, like after the SGA free throws, it's a 9-point game with less than 3 minutes to go. So you're assuming at that point that they are going to win it, right? Because you don't usually blow a 9-point lead with less than 3 minutes to go. Then, like I said, Nesmith 3, then the Nembhard 3, right, where he's dribbling into his shot with SGA switched onto him. Because actually, for most of the closing stretch, crunch time, it's Nembhard who has the ball in his hands. It's actually not Tyrese Haliburton, even though he's the one that ends up hitting the game winner, right? Then, like I said, then SGA with the layup, 5-point game, couple of Nembhard free throws, 3-point game. Then you have the couple of possessions where you're like, oh, the Lou Dort block might have saved OKC. Then all of a sudden Siakam gets a block on SGA. Then they get the transition bucket which misses. Then Siakam puts it back in. 1-point game. And you had a couple of rough possessions where Jalen Williams, he has that weird driving layup, right, that ends up not going in, where he's just kind of just pressing. And you could tell there's a couple of rough possessions where, like, a lot of the non-SGA guys didn't have it for Oklahoma City. And then SGA, he has that attempt to close out the game, that fadeaway shot that we've seen him make hundreds of times. It actually does miss. Credit to Nembhard for playing good defense. I mean, we've seen him make that shot, but still, if you want a chance to make it miss, you got to defend it, and he did. And then credit to Carlisle, didn't call a timeout, just let them go. And then Nesmith gets the rebound. He has 12 rebounds, and this is kind of key because that's part of their ability to make the comeback is they're getting the stops, they're getting the rebounds, and they're pushing the ball even more so than OKC. Then Haliburton has the ball, runs the clock down, gets to a spot about like a foot or so inside the three-point line, which you don't normally see. It's officially listed as a 21-foot pull-up jump shot. And then that's the game, right? It's 0.3 seconds left. The commentators say that there's plenty of time to get off a shot, not with 0.3 seconds left.
Agreed.
So all they can really do is just throw the ball in and hope that there's like a tip or something like that. They don't get it. And Indiana takes game 1. And it's funny because, you know, I picked Oklahoma City in 6 because I thought Indiana had shown that it's a different team than the team that we saw earlier in the season, and they've made a legitimate deep run. I didn't necessarily feel like it was still enough to be able to beat Oklahoma City, but if you're going to win the series, this would be a good way to do it, is to take game 1 on the road. Now you just have to go 3-3 the rest of the way, and, you know, the championship is yours. And, you know, you took one in OKC, so there's a pathway where you could just win one in OKC, then win all the Indiana games, then it's yours, you know, if it's going to be in 6, I guess. But, you know, with Oklahoma City, I still would pick them to win this series. I think I would need to see Indiana take game 2 for me to be, before I get a little bit concerned. You know, obviously, I guess OKC could storm back and win game 2, and then maybe they lose game 3 and it's 2-1. But I would need it to either be 2-0 Indiana or probably like 3-2 Indiana before, you know, I would be concerned about OKC might actually lose this series. But we'll see. From the OKC perspective, offensively, they were pretty bad, especially in that fourth quarter. I mean, for most of the game, they weren't good. But, you know, in the fourth quarter, Indiana was 50% from the field, 60% from 3. Just 3 turnovers, right, where Oklahoma City shoots 37% from the field, 0 of 5 from 3, missed a couple of free throws. And for the game, right, Indiana was 48 from the field, 46 from 3, 18 of 39 overall. Right, that'll get it done because that's something that Indiana has to do because they're the best three-point shooting team in the playoffs, but for most of the season, they weren't amongst the higher volume three-point shooting teams because we talked about it. They have a very balanced offensive diet, but they're going to have to make more threes in this series because some of those are the type of shots that OKC will give up, right? Like OKC can give up corner threes. They'll close out on them, but like there was a Miles Turner corner three in the fourth quarter, right? That he hit. That was a big shot. I think it cut it to like 8 or whatever it was. Um, and then OKC, 39% from the field, actually 37% from three, which is funny. But most of that was SGA and Lou Dort, because Lou Dort gave him 5 threes, which he's been bad from three in the postseason. He shot 30%, but he actually gave him 5 threes in this game, which is funny because you think usually that's a game that you win. Like you get a bunch of threes from Lou Dort, multiple stocks, and you get 38 from SGA. But then you look around and it's like Chet Holmgren, 6 points, 6 rebounds, 2 for 9 from the field, only 23 minutes, didn't even close. They closed actually without a big, both teams actually, because neither Turner nor Chet or Hartenstein were in that closing 5, right? I think it was Toppin and Siakam were the 4-5 for Indiana, and then the 4-5 was like, what, Jalen Williams at center?
Yeah.
I think for Oklahoma City?
Yep.
Yeah, and Caruso, I think, was in that closing group too, right? So just, I don't know. Jalen Williams, 6 of 19 from the field, so not a great job there. Again, you give credit to Indiana defensively because they actually did do what they have been doing, where picking guys up, full court, harassing them, making sure that they get some of these correct matchups. Haliburton in the fourth was better defensively because they had a couple of stretches where they were trying to force him to make decisions defensively off the ball, and it was working. Like Cason Wallace got a couple of backdoor buckets. They even forced SGA to play more defense than you probably normally would. And like he's a good defender. It's not like he can't defend. But like having to do that plus also score, that's a big responsibility. But it's tough because even with all that, OKC should have won this game, but we've seen Indiana pull this off now multiple times over the course of the entire postseason, right? It's Halliburton's 5th game-tying or game-winning shot in the playoffs, right, this postseason alone. So, obviously, I don't think there's too many big changes I would make for Oklahoma City. I mean, I guess you could consider going back to the double big starting 5, but push the pace a little more too, right? Because there was probably a little too much walking the ball up, slow process offensively. And it was like, even with SGA, like he took like 30 shots. And again, he made most of them and scored 38, but he only had 3 assists. And yeah, we talked about that before we actually got on. Like it's tough to get a lot of assists when a lot of guys aren't making shots. And Jalen Williams had 6 assists, but that was also Indiana's defense by design, right? Like they weren't really sending like a bajillion guys all the time at him, right? It was kind of like forcing him into these spots where they're almost inviting him to kind of go one-on-one and try to beat the individual matchup. And yeah, you need that for a decent chunk of the game, but you also need the other guys to help you out. But that's what Indiana's doing. They're like, we're not going to, if we're going to lose, like, I guess they're just kind of banking on like, SGA, go right ahead, score 40 if you want. And we'll see what happens with these other guys, and we'll go from there. But I thought OKC might have galaxy brained it too much with the starting 5. And again, maybe by the end of the series they come to that conclusion anyways. Like let's say they, I don't know, lose game 3 or 4 and it's like 2-2, and then they're like, all right, let's make the change now. Maybe that would have happened anyways, because you see teams downsize sometimes as the series goes on. But I don't think you need to do that because they've won 80 games combined, regular season and playoffs. So make Indiana adjust to you. They're basically like, we'll make this decision to try to match Indiana's small ball. But, that small Indiana lineup, they're a little bigger than Oklahoma City, right? Because you got Siakam, 6'8", 6'9". Toppin's what, 6'8", 6'9", something like that. And then, Nesmith, I guess, is what, 6'6", but he's the 3. Yeah. So, their closing 5, who's the smallest guy? It is either Nembhard or Haliburton.
Yeah,
right?
probably
And both of those guys are, both of those guys are, relatively sizable for guards, right? I think Nembhard is, what, 6'4"? I think Halliburton's like 6'4" or 5.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I didn't really like that decision there, but
I agree.
Obviously, great game, first off, right? Because there's been a lot of conversation going into this series about a lot of people saying like, this is a garbage matchup, right? 2 small market teams, not a lot of star power. We didn't say that, right? But there's been some talk about that going around, and I'm glad that we got a great game 1. Obviously, I picked OKC to win the series, so I'm hoping my pick turns out correctly. But great game one win by Indiana, right? Because I don't think most people saw it coming, especially when OKC went up double digits. And like I said, they were up 9 with 3 minutes to go in the game. But Indiana's been doing this all season, so got to give them props because this is what they do.
Yeah, once again, I think, you do have to start by tipping your hat to the Indiana Pacers, right? Like you just said, it's, phenomenal what these guys have been able to accomplish, throughout the postseason. And, they've been on a phenomenal run. And we talked about it going into this finals matchup. Like, Indiana is not to really be taken lightly, right? They've been pretty much on par with Oklahoma City, since you're around like what the
February.
yeah, exactly, like so post All-Star break. So, they've been on a different level of playing. And I think that's the cool part, right? Because you do have a guy like Tyrese Haliburton who is finding his own and responding to a lot of negativity that's kind of been, circulating around him. But yeah, once again, a wild shot from him. The basketball IQ is there 100%. I like the coaching for sure. And they're deep, right? And you talked about it. Like, there's no singular guy, right, in this on this roster and in this game that went off, right? You didn't get like a 30-point game from Halliburton or Siakam, right? This is a team effort, right? Where everybody kind of showed up and rallied in that fourth quarter and really took it to another gear, right? On both ends of the floor. And that's the cool part because this isn't, the Indiana from last year. This is, a brand new version where they've got, some dogs on defense and as a unit, right? They know what to do. They, like you said, they press up, they make guys uncomfortable. And it's a mind game, right? And I think that's the cool part, right? They're really kind of delving into that, which is, very intriguing. I didn't really expect this. Like you said, nobody probably did. And from the Thunder perspective, wow, I think this is super disappointing, right? This feels like the Thunder from last year, right? Where it's just pretty much Shea, maybe one other fringe like performance like from Lou Dort, and then Chet and J-Dub don't show up. And I think that's super frustrating because if they just show up, I think the game is pretty much iced. However, the game, I thought it was pretty much over when they went up 10 with with like 3 minutes left, 4 minutes left. Like I thought, that's closing time. But lo and behold, the Pacers, they did it again. I don't know what's going on. Defensively, I think the Thunder, they did a great job throughout the majority of the game. They got after guys just like, Indiana did in that final stretch. But I feel like you've got to keep up that tenacity. Maybe they ran out of gas, but I agree with you. I hate that starting lineup change. Why? I didn't understand the logic. Like I do get it in terms of trying to match up better with the Pacers, but at the end of the day, I feel like you should just go with what's been working, like you said, for all these games that you won and, what's made you a historic squad. But for some reason, they went away from that. And I think that definitely messed up the flow, I think, on really the offensive end. And I don't know, it just didn't really look that good. But it really sucks to waste, an SJ performance like that where he is scoring at a high volume, he's super aggressive. I did like that. However, I think, when Chet and J-Dub just don't show up and Shea has a game like that, and then also the Lou Dort performance where he's doing pretty much everything on both ends of the floor while also, knocking down threes at a crazy efficient volume like he did in the regular season, it sucks. I think it's painful. You lost by 1, so... But then, from the Pacers perspective, right, you could easily say, well, imagine if these guys played stellar basketball in the first half, we'd be having a completely different conversation, right? The Pacers might have won by 20, and that's the scary part, right? And I think this is why some people were a little bit lower on Oklahoma City, not necessarily going into the series, but going into the postseason. We didn't know how they would look in close games because they have blown out a lot of teams, in the regular season and in the postseason as well. So when it comes to these close games, I think it could be a little bit, exactly, and it could be a little bit nerve-wracking, I guess, for people who did pick the Oklahoma City Thunder. But at the end of the day, the Pacers, they've proven that no lead is safe in the playoffs. So shout out to them for sure.
Yeah, and it's funny because you could tell early on some of those guys looked pretty tentative, pretty nervous,
Yep.
right? Because like you could see it from Halliburton. You could definitely see it from Obi Toppin.
Oh, yeah,
Right,
big
because
time.
he got pulled early on, and then credit to Carlisle, he put him back in.
Yep.
Trusted that he could figure it out. Figured it out, made a bunch of threes that, like you said at the time, you're like, oh, that's nice. He's kind of found a rhythm. That'll help for next game. Not thinking that they would come back and actually win the game. And, Indiana in the second half, again, I mentioned they had 19 turnovers in the first half. They finished with 24. So you know what that means in the second half? They only had 5, right? So they cleaned up their act offensively really well because they shot 50% from the field and from three, 10 of 20 from three in the second half. 28 rebounds. Like I mentioned, that rebounding margin is significant. And it kind of, like you said, some of this stuff kind of goes into the fact that like Indiana could be better too, because like OKC, they don't normally lose a game where, because we talked about it, like not only do they force turnovers, but this part didn't even mention when we were talking about the matchup. Like OKC takes care of the ball; they don't turn the ball over a ton,
Right.
and they only had six, which is really good. They only had six turnovers, and they forced 24, and they still lost. Right, so what's going to happen potentially if Indiana doesn't turn the ball over 24 times? What if they turn it over like 15 times? What if it's like, I don't know, 12 times?
Right.
I don't know what it's going to be next game, but you see what I'm getting at here, right?
Yes,
So
I
that's
did.
just kind of, yeah. So both teams could be better. I don't think we saw either team's best in game one, but if you're Indiana, obviously you feel great because that wasn't your best, but you won the game when you probably statistically shouldn't have won the game. So now, right, if you're OKC, now you have to win game two, right? Game two is a must win because obviously if they don't win game two, they're down 0-2 at home. Series is potentially over, right? Because that's kind of been the pattern usually that we've seen in the playoffs, especially if you lose the first two games at home. I mean, we'll see. I think they'll bounce back game two. It wouldn't shock me if it was a blowout, right? Because that's kind of what we see. Because we actually saw this against Denver, right? Where they controlled most of that game one against Denver. Then all of a sudden, boom, in the last 5 minutes, they puke the game away, and Denver just takes it from them, right? Chet misses a couple of free throws, and then what happens, right? They have the other weird stuff where they intentionally foul, bring Jokic back in when they probably shouldn't have, and then Aaron Gordon gets the game-winning three, right? Denver actually had them 2-1 right through the first three games, and then games 4 and 5 were toss-ups.
Yeah.
So, if you're Indiana, think you're defensively doing what you need to do, right? Like I don't think Indiana really needs to change a whole lot because they won the game. I mean, obviously they were down double digits for most of the game, but I think some of that as they get more comfortable will probably help. And I think you'll have a bigger game from some of these guys. Like Haliburton, I think will have a big game, even better than this one at some point, right? Same with Siakam, right? We've seen it dozens of times from this team.
Yeah.
So and either way, I picked OKC in six, so I think Indiana will win at least one more, anyways. But
Yeah. It's wild,
if
man.
you're OKC, yeah, but if you're OKC, yeah, that's pretty brutal, right? To lose that game the way you did. But I think they've also shown that they're a very resilient team. Because again, like I already mentioned, right, they were down in the Denver series, and we've seen them bounce back and respond after some rough losses, right? They lost by 40 to Minnesota in game three, and then they bounced back and won game four, and then blew out Minnesota in game five. So this is a different team, right, from those teams, obviously. Because Indiana offensively, right, has a lot more playmaking and a lot more juice than Minnesota does, right? Even though they don't have, like an ant type scorer necessarily, right? They have a lot more that they can work with, I think.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
yeah. So feels like it might be tough for Oklahoma City to win it in five because that means they'd have to win four straight. So it might go six. We'll see because we've seen teams win. I think OKC right back in 2012, right? They won game one against Miami, then they lost four straight. So we'll see if maybe there's a reverse of that from Oklahoma City. But I don't know. I mean, what adjustments would you make if you're Oklahoma City? Because it feels like, I mean, it's tough because what they were doing was still working for most of the game because they were up. So it's kind of hard to say completely, yeah, that was stupid. What were you thinking when they had a double digit lead at different points, but they still lost the game? And now you're kind of looking back and it's like, yeah, how can they be better on the boards, right? How could they be better in terms of maybe the offensive process, right? So that's probably what we're looking at. What do we want to see maybe in those categories so that way you don't have, a porous offensive performance like that again?
Yeah, I mean, go back to, your initial lineup, the one that's been working for the entire regular season and postseason as well. It's what got you here. Don't stray away from it. It's your identity. Yeah, it might not necessarily be, a phenomenal matchup on one end of the floor, but I feel like it's going to allow you to dominate on the offensive floor because that's where you really, I think, need to, step your game up, right? And realistically, it also comes down to just J-Dub and Chet have to be better. Simple as that, right? And then, I mean, I don't know, like, what schematic adjustments that you could really make. I think they just need to calm it down and play their brand of basketball, right? I think it's bad when Shea is forcing a lot of stuff, and honestly, like it's not even on him because these guys weren't really contributing a whole lot. Like you said, the 3 assists and also the 30 shots. Like he was kind of just a one man army out there, and credit to him because that's a lot of firepower, and that's how skilled he is because he was keeping them afloat and up in that game. But I think those guys have to be better. But I would definitely strongly consider going back to the original lineup because Kassan Wallace, Caruso, Isaiah Joe, like all those guys coming off the bench, I think makes you more dangerous than having a guy like Hartenstein coming off the bench.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the very least, the other thing that I may not do if I'm OKC is I don't know if you can do those micro ball lineups where it's like no center at all.
I
Because it
agree.
feels like when you had one, you were okay.
Mm-hmm.
But then the moment you're kind of running like Jalen Williams at center or some of that other stuff, it felt like that's where it started to not really look that
I
great.
agree.
Because, like if Indiana's not running any centers, they could still be bigger. Like I mentioned, they closed with Siakam and Toppin. Those are two big, relatively mobile, athletic guys, right? Whereas if you're OKC, yeah, they have some athletic guys with length, but they're a little smaller. So that's probably something that I would look at. Also, the AJ Mitchell minutes. What was the thought process there? Was it just for another ball handler off the bench, a little bit more size and defense?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in the moments that I saw him, didn't really look that good, right? He like tried to
Looked a
do
little out of control.
yeah, exactly. I think he did a wild pull up three, got his own rebound, and then did a wild floater. At that point, I was like, oh, okay, why is he in? I mean, I guess I do understand the thought process because during the regular season, he was very good, super underrated, but I don't know if that was necessary. I think, I would have preferred those minutes maybe go to a guy like
Just
Aaron
walk.
Wiggins or, Caruso, add more Caruso minutes, Chet, whatever, something else. I think you needed more.
Edward Williams
Yeah, that could have helped too because I mean like
played
he
like
did a good
30
job. He did a good job, in the previous series against Julius Randle at times. Like I think that might have been something that you could have used against, a guy like Siakam because at the end of the day, like Siakam was also a big part as to why they lost this game too, right? Because he's the primary
offensive
reason.
rebound.
Exactly, and he's the primary reason that Indiana is able to play small like that. And that's what we talked
Yeah,
about going into the series was that was probably the one and only advantage that they had was the ability to really play small and kind of force Oklahoma City to get out of their brand of basketball. But still, I think they need to run that double big lineup. It's so elite on both ends of the floor that there's no excuse to really stray away from it.
yeah, and like Chet's offensive possessions, there were a number of them where they were kind of just like out of control drives
Yep,
towards Miles Turner, and it's like you like the aggressiveness, but it's just a little too out of control,
I
and it
agree.
wasn't working,
Yep,
and it was hurting them. Then he's on the floor. Then Indiana's getting out in transition and doing what they can do. So yeah, like some of it's just like yeah, if those guys are okay, then they probably would have won this game because they were about to win it anyway. So I think if those three guys, if you get two out of those three guys playing well, that should probably help OKC win the game, right?
yeah,
And then maybe you get like a couple of other okay performances out of some other guys. But like I said, I I still think Oklahoma City will win this series. But if you're Indiana, I mean statistically, when you win game one, you got a really good shot at winning the series, right? So they're kind of in the driver's seat
yeah, big
right
time.
now. So we'll see what Oklahoma City does in order to potentially turn this around, right? Because, obviously for them, they were significantly favored, right? Like, I mean, and even with being significant favorites, they were also kind of assumed that they were going to win this going away. Like, a lot of people like you, like not just you, but most people kind of defaulted to OKC in
Yeah,
five,
yep,
right? Just because of how well OKC's been over the course of the season. But, Indiana has shown that they can hang with them, at least in the fourth quarter. So, we'll see. But OKC, still need to find a way to force turnovers. Just can you do a better job at maybe converting some of those? Because that was, I think, the other reason why they never broke away. Because I talked about it earlier, where Indiana did a good job at transition D. But like I said, if OKC can play a little bit more sped up, then that'll probably help. Maybe that's harder to do with double bigs. Like I said, maybe that's why they started Wallace. But
right.
I don't know. I would have just preferred them going back, and then maybe if the double big lineup isn't working early, then maybe you just pull the plug early and then you go to the smaller lineup. But
Yeah.
like I said, some of that's hard to say in hindsight because they had a big lead for most of the game. So, or not big, but they were up for the entire game. But I guess then from Indiana's perspective, is there anything you would do differently going into game 2 so that way maybe you can win again?
Um, I think you kind of have to go in now. You've won the game one, right? Like that's kind of like you said, put yourself in the driver's seat. Now, don't take your foot off the gas, right? I think if I'm Halliburton, I'm being aggressive. We already know that when that guy's aggressive, it opens up a whole different version of that squad that is just arguably the best team in the Eastern Conference, right? So I think that's the cool part that they do have going for them there. So I do want to see him be aggressive. I know that's not necessarily like a schematic adjustment or lineup thing. I would definitely lean on your wings and your kind of like your big guys like Obi Toppin for sure. I think you kind of have to keep playing him, keep giving him momentum and confidence and stuff like that. And I honestly probably close the same way that you closed the game one, right? You don't really necessarily need a guy like Miles Turner out there if you're gonna dictate how the game is played on both ends of the floor. And that's where like you said, I think Oklahoma City kind of played right into Indiana's hands where they were adjusting when low key it should have been the other way around, right? So I think you kind of just run it back. That's what I would really say. And like I said, close the game just like you did. And I expect that Tyrese Haliburton will be aggressive.
Yeah, I'd say that those are probably some good decisions. Were there any other guys off the bench's play that you liked, or that maybe you might think Indiana you might would like to see more of over the course of the series, other than the obvious ones?
I mean, I don't know if you consider McConnell obvious, but I think he's always been, since he's been on the team,
Right.
that low key off the bench second unit floor general, and that kind of continued, right? He always has timely shots, not necessarily like a box score monster or anything like that, but his shots are very timely. He knows how to calm it down. But I mean, I would kind of like to see a little bit more of him. I thought Ben Shepherd wasn't too horrible. There were stretches where I think defensively I was like, what the heck? He's getting fried, by Shea, but it wasn't, detrimental, I don't think.
Yeah, and then
Matherin
Mather, he
continues
had
to be
like
up and down.
yeah, because he had that huge block, and then
Yeah,
he
wow.
had I think the drive to the basket and got to the line a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
then he was also like 1 for 5,
Right,
-8, and like the plus minuses are weird for this game just because like Indiana was down for almost the entire game,
right,
so like Siakam's a -10, right? But I don't think you would have said like he had a horrible game, right?
right.
Like he had a not a great game, but like a decent game.
Yeah.
Yeah. So moving on, game 2. What are you thinking, right? Because I said I think OKC bounces back and wins
Mm-hmm.
game 2, and it wouldn't shock me if it was a blowout.
Right.
But what do you think?
Um, I'm going with Oklahoma City here. I think, realistically, we know exactly what this team is and has been throughout the regular season and postseason. We know that they're a dominant force. And I don't expect them to kind of just take this lightly, right? I expect them to 100% respond. They're a responsive team, right? We've seen them kind of with their backs against the wall early in series before, like you talked about with the Denver one. And I just think, they're going to find something and they're going to get it together. I think J Dub and Chet are probably going to show up a lot better. I think Shea will probably have a worse performance, but I think it'll be beneficial because I think the team will play better and it'll be more of a collective effort on the offensive end. I think defensively, they're going to be just as good as they were in this game because honestly, I really didn't hate anything defensively from this squad up until pretty much the final minute. But yeah, overall, I think they're just going to silence a lot of the underdog narrative here.
I like I said, I think OKC will bounce back
Yep.
and get that win. And again, we'll see what they do with the double bigs. Like, do you expect them to go back to it, or do you think that they stick with this new lineup?
I want them to go back to it, but I feel like they're going to stick to it because I think the thought process was, guys, we played 4 amazing quarters of basketball on both ends of the floor. but that final minute, it was just horrible, right? It really reminds me of like the Knicks game, Knicks Pacers game 1, where they played phenomenal on both ends of the floor and they still lost, right? To crazy Haliburton, stuff, and obviously the overtime that didn't help, but yeah, I don't expect them to probably change a whole lot. I would if I was them. I don't think there's a reason to stray away from the double big lineup. I don't understand the logic fully.
Yeah, and then from an Indiana perspective, I mean, this is like all time stuff where it just feels like every game they've managed to find a way to. I mean, because they've only lost what 4 games in the postseason, I think, right? Because 1 to Milwaukee, 1 to Cleveland, 2 to New York, right?
Yep.
So they're 13-4 in the postseason, and 3 out of the 4 matchups that they've played, they're the underdog, right? So I mean, it's pretty incredible. And they're like, and you're getting one guy hitting like all of the big shots. I know. I mean, I know Neesmith in Game 1 for the Knicks had some big shots, but like just as a whole, I mean, it's super impressive. And like that's where I'm kind of wondering, like moving on from here, like he's building a really strong case for himself, right? Where like we talked about in that Knicks series, right? The idea of like is he a top 10 guy? And we know that there's going to start to be, a louder conversation for that if the Pacers continue to go on the strong run. So really props to Halliburton. So we'll see what he
Yeah.
does from here on out. And like you said, I expect him to be more aggressive.
Yeah.
And like I said, both teams I don't think played great in Game 1. So I think we'll see a better performance in Game 2 from both, but I expect OKC to win it and tie it up. They have to. If they
Yeah.
don't, I think they're probably going to lose the series.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So moving on, obviously, at this point, we really only had the finals, but we actually had a big story that occurred since the last time we met, where Tom Thibodeau, coach for the New York Knicks, fired after 5 seasons. It's funny because I think when we were talking before about the Knicks elimination, we were kind of wondering, like, is he going to get fired? And I think we were like, probably don't need to fire him.
Right.
But they did, obviously. And now, once the Knicks got eliminated, because I talked about it, you had those stories that had kind of come out where it's like the now they tell us story that we always get whenever an unhappy team gets eliminated in the playoffs. You just didn't think that they were an unhappy team, but clearly they were, right? A lot of players only meetings, some criticisms of mostly a combination of Thibs and Cat, right? It felt like that was the tenor of most of what was being reported was they were not very happy with either of those guys for long stretches of the season. So now Thibs is gone, and I guess the question is who's his replacement? The Suns, I guess we'll get to them in a minute, right? They hired a coach, Jordan Ott, right? So there's some other guy, Johnny Bryant, who could potentially be there. But now there's also some louder noise about Jason Kidd, right? Because they were trying to talk to Udoka. Think they'll probably get rebuked on that one because I don't think they're letting them go. But the
Yeah.
Kidd one, they're expected to speak with Jason Kidd pretty soon. We'll see what happens there. But I guess from your perspective, right, you're the Knicks guy. You're the guy that picked them to win the title. Do you think this was the right choice?
I think it's valid, and I know it probably stings. I think for Knicks fans and Thibodeau supporters and stuff, but I think you have to look at it from a wider lens. Like, yes, he built the culture. Yes, he got you there, but can he get you out of there? Right? Like, I think realistically, we know what this team was built to do. We said it from the jump. They were built to beat Boston. They did that. They accomplished the goal. But the true end goal became the finals, and it was clear that they didn't have enough firepower, number one, to reach there. But at the same time, I think you look at Thibs and his coaching style, right? It's kind of a old school esque, kind of coaching style, but at the same time, very stubborn, right? Can sometimes get in his own way, for sure. And I think, the regular season is a time for experimentation, and I don't think he experimented enough to the point where, you might find some hidden gem depth pieces that you could have really used in the postseason. And I think that was really, really frustrating, right? Like you could have used, maybe some younger guys just to give yourself some spot minutes and give, a lot of your guys a rest, because I think they do have some quality role players that just don't have enough, maybe experience or, a trust or a rapport with the coaching staff to be on the floor and be playable guys, right? And I think that's kind of frustrating. We've seen this, throughout his career. being the head coach in Chicago, being the head coach in Minnesota, right? Like it's kind of always followed him, right? And I think, the funny part about, him and Towns, having a relationship, going back to the Minnesota days is kind of funny as well. Like it didn't work out there. I guess I never really understood why people would think that it would potentially work out in New York, in that regard, and how those ideals would mesh, right? We know Towns isn't really a defender, and Thibodeau kind of likes, hard knocks guys, right? So I think it's the right decision. I think there could be a potential, not necessarily like, a culture rebuild, but, maybe a culture refresh, right? Where you kind of just need a little bit of a different voice, somebody who's willing to experiment. But also, the front office, right? Like you gambled a lot. You threw away a lot of your future for a valuable player, Mikal Bridges, but at the same time, you didn't really bolster up the bench too much. Like you missed Robinson for a lot of the season, but you didn't really get a lot of insurance in terms of like, oh well, what are our non-Brunson minutes going to look like? What are our non Towns minutes going to look like? And you just never really got that offensive firepower off of the bench. So I think there's a good foundation there, but I think something needs to give. And unfortunately, it was Thibodeau first.
Yeah, we'll see. I think it's a. I think the decision is fine because I
Yeah.
mean, I guess they could also kind of ask themselves like, did we get a little bit fortunate, right, in terms of like maybe we actually got a little further than what we actually were, right? Something along those lines, right? They were down double digits every game, still pulled them out and won. But maybe it's sort of a confirmation of like, yeah, we're probably not quite good enough. Maybe the roster wasn't maximized, but we still have changes that we have to make. So I would still say you need to get some roster upgrades done. Whether or not they can do that and not have to give up any pieces, I don't know, right? Because I mean, there's still been talks about, right? I think Sham said that they had tried to, or they tried to offer stuff for KD at the deadline, right? So like clearly they were trying to, or they were willing to do something relatively significant, right? Maybe the Suns rebuked the offer, maybe Durant rebuked it. I don't know. I don't know what the offer was. You can probably guess
Right.
given the contracts on that roster. So that would suggest to me that at the very least, like this roster probably will look at least somewhat different, right?
Yep. I agree.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then I guess the question is, of those coaches, is there anyone that kind of, I don't know, speaks to you or like, one that like you think would be a really good signing? Because, outside of Kid, I just don't know enough about some of the other guys and nobody's mentioned Malone. And I think part of that is he's kind of like Tibbs, right? And so they probably wouldn't just hire him anyways.
Yeah. That's not
But
going to work.
yeah, but what do you think of Kid?
I mean that's interesting, right? He's a guy who is known to experiment a lot, right? I think he's willing to go as far as he needs to, in terms of his depth chart and what guys can bring to the team on both ends of the floor. So I would be intrigued, what that pairing looks like, and I'm really more so looking at the front office, right? I think more eyes should be on them, right? Because they need to fix that roster before they really bring in another head coach, I guess, in terms of that, because or else you're just going to have the same situation repeat over and over and over. So, and the problem is financially, right? Their hands are somewhat tied, right? They can't do a whole lot. Like they can't just go out and grab like, some amazing free agents and stuff like that. So they're going to have to work for a lot of the deals that they are going to have to, attempt to pull off. But it should be interesting. And I think Kid meshes pretty well because I think he does have a balanced focus in terms of, what he likes to do on the court on both ends of the floor. And I think that's what the Knicks need, right? You can't just be, pretty good or very good on offense and be mediocre on defense and vice versa, right? Like, look at the teams in the finals. You have to be competitive on both ends.
Yeah, so we'll see what happens, from there on
Yeah.
out because obviously there's still plenty of time for the Knicks to figure that out, right? So, they're I mean, do they have a pick in this draft?
Um, I believe it's actually going to. I think it has something to do with the Wizards, right?
Right.
I think it's top 8 protected for the Wizards or something like that. So if the
Yeah, so
Wizards
like
get a top 8
yeah.
pick,
But like either way, like they're not in a rush, I would say,
yeah,
to
Yeah.
get the coach, right?
Yeah.
Because they already have, they got to find some other stuff as well.
Yeah.
But I guess if you get the coach, then you can get an idea of like these are the type of players they might like to have on the roster. So
Sure.
we'll see, what happens with that. But either way, I think it's gonna be good.
Yeah.
So we'll
I
see what
agree.
happens. So moving on, I guess in terms of rumors around the NBA, uh, not a lot going on as of right now. There's been talks about the Giannis stuff slowing down, and again, I think for some of that, going to be dependent on what happens in the summer, right? Because right now the finals are going on, so I don't think we're going to get like a lot of big stuff from ESPN. There was a thing about Garland from the Cavs potentially being on the trade block under the right circumstances. Of course, we don't know what they're going to do. I think that was Windhorst who put that out there. So we'll see, what happens with that, whether or not he gets moved. I mean, they don't have to. I mean, I think he hasn't been healthy, unfortunately. So we haven't really gotten to see a lot of what it looks like come playoff time. And maybe that's a problem. Maybe you just won't get that,
Right.
right? He's, a guy that's pretty slight of frame, but I don't know. I don't know if I would be in a complete rush to do that one.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, like you said, I wouldn't necessarily be like, foaming at the mouth to jump ship here. Like, I would be open to trading him because it depends on the market, right? Like, if you can get a better player in return or, player of similar caliber, but that meshes well and maybe meshes better than, what we saw from Cleveland this year, which I think would be, you know, a hard task to, kind of, pull off. But I think, he's probably a franchise player,
Yeah.
borderline.
From Mark Stein, Kevin Durant linked to the Raptors. Could he potentially be going north? So sounds like for Toronto, it could be a scenario where they also want Giannis, but maybe they don't get Giannis. Maybe he goes to another team.
Right.
Maybe he doesn't get traded. We don't
Right.
know what's going to happen there. But if, those are the two kind of, I guess, pivots for the offseason, right? Like, we're going to see where Giannis goes. If he doesn't go anywhere, we're going to see where Durant goes. And those are probably like the two central guys for the summer, right? Because those are
Hmm.
the guys that teams want.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the package would be. Obviously, we know he's makes a lot of money, makes about $50 million if I'm not mistaken, and he's in going into the last year of his deal. So whoever's going to get him, going to have to find a way to package some salary to put that together and make it work. But then probably also not give up, but so much so that way you don't completely gut your team. Because then if you do that, right, then I mean, how is that really much different? But then I'm like, what even would the deal be if it's Toronto, right? Because it's like you already have what 3, 4 wings on that roster, right? Because you already have Ingram. I mean, you have Scotty Barnes, you have Ingram, and you have R.J. Barrett, right? Now, maybe not all those guys are future pieces, right? But you would think you wouldn't really want to give up Barnes just because you drafted him, and that's the guy that they've invested a lot of money in. I mean, most of the other guys, I think if there was a deal available, you would be okay with moving on from them. But that would be my question: would be what even is the deal?
Yeah. I mean, I think Toronto has something up their sleeve, right? That like we already knew it was a weird concoction when they did end up trading, for Brandon Ingram, right? Because you look at the roster, like, what is the goal here? What is the end game goal? So it seems like they're probably building a package of some sort to get some sort of superstar that has, an insane, contract. But yeah, like you said, I think the tough part is teams are probably going to want Scotty Barnes, literally, like probably in return. And I don't think Toronto would probably be too enthusiastic about that. They'd probably want a couple, maybe like RJ Barrett and Brandon Ingram, or like, Brandon Ingram and IQ or something like that. I don't know. But I am curious, how that saga is going to end, because I think it's very clear that, Durant will not be a Phoenix Sun next year.
Yeah, it's just a matter of where does he end up
Right.
going? Is there a spot he wants to go to? Is there because I know there's going to be multiple teams that want him, right? Because like you and I both talked about, it could be like a Butler thing where yeah, we know that there's been a lot of talking about this guy, but teams will want him. And if he goes there and you don't have to give up a lot, he can make a difference. So it's all about just what those teams end up giving up. And I don't know what that's going to be, but
Right.
I wouldn't give up but so much at this point.
I
And
agree.
I don't think a team will do that anyways, right? I think we don't have a lot of front offices now that just make a lot of dumb decisions.
I agree.
Yeah. So now moving on, just addressing a comment from our last short that we did, and this comes from Don't Trust Them 917, right? And the comment is SGA flops like a soccer player. So what do we think about that one?
I mean, I don't think he flops. I think he draws contact. And yeah, I mean, simple as that. Like, the guy's good at getting to the line, and that's, part of his game. It's not like he gets to the line at a historic rate or anything like that. And like, I think he had one of the better quotes actually in terms of, what addressing this whole thing, right? Because this isn't, a career year in terms of, free throw attempts for him. Like, there was one year, I think, when he was averaging 31 when they had a very bad record, and he was averaging, I think, around 9.9 free throws a game, something like that. I think it was around 9 or something like that. And he was like, yeah, nobody cared when I was doing this when we were losing, but now that I'm winning, it's a problem. And I'm like, yeah, I agree, because, the bias is crazy.
It was 2022, 2023. He averaged 31 a game and got 11, just under 11 a game.
There it is. So, it's crazy that was the year where he was, really foul baiting.
Yeah, I think that was the year where they were in the play-in.
Yep.
That was the first year we did our podcast.
Yep.
Yeah, so, nice anniversary there.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes. Then also we had on IG, we had our poll of who's winning the NBA Finals, and 100% of our results said Oklahoma City. So, like I said, most people I think are pretty set on Oklahoma City winning the series. Obviously, didn't win game one, but, again, it's first to four. It's not, just one win.
Right.
And, the OKC guys know that too. So I think, like I said, they'll adjust and respond, and we'll see what happens.
The response is going to be loud.
Yeah. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, great game one. Hopefully the rest of the finals will be, just as awesome as this. I don't know if it will be, but I hope it is, right? Just because of the conversations going in. And hopefully, you stick around with us so that way we can give you all the content. If you want to join on IG and join the polls and, have your responses be looked at, we'll look at it. Just do at the OBT podcast on IG. And then obviously if you leave a comment on short, video, whichever, we'll pick one and we'll read that just like we just did. And also continue to like and subscribe to our channel to help our content grow. So we appreciate all the support. We'll see you next episode.